Hi all, welcome back. This module we're talking about rhetoric and technical communication. So we're talking about the connection between the kind of classical study of effective means of communication or persuasion and how that can be used as a tool to better understand technical writing situations. So you might think of our subtitle here, Understanding Rhetorical Problems to Solve Workplace Problems. So when we set this up, we're talking about two different types of problems. One is the workplace problem. Those are real world issues that present obstacles to a particular workplace environment. In other words, the thing the document is trying to actually solve in the workplace. So it might be a manual about appropriate behavior because we want to make sure that our employees behave appropriately. It might be a warning sign because we want to make sure that people in the workplace don't get hurt. These are real problems. Now, how we communicate that information, what that manual looks like, or what that sign looks like and says, are rhetorical problems. So they relate to the difficulties or troubles involved in the production of a text or a document, right? That in technical writing means a document meant to help solve that workplace problem. So workplace problems are the beginning of the work for technical writers. Technical writers aren't tasked with writing just random things, right? They're not poets or authors, right? Creating creative texts who texts that kind of grow naturally from the writer, him or herself. Instead, technical writers are being tasked with writing documents that address particular needs in a workplace. Okay. And so that starts with the ability to understand the problem itself. So workplace problems require both information and action to solve, right? So they have to understand the problem and the solution and what to actually do to solve the problem. Professionals, of course, solve field-specific problems all the time, right? But knowledge about the solution to a problem is different from the ability to communicate that solution to others. So think about it this way. Technical writers don't necessarily come up with these solutions or identify the problems in the workplace. Instead, their focus is on communicating that solution to that problem to the users who need to implement it. Okay? If you work for an engineering firm, you probably don't know or understand the engineering well enough to understand to derive your own solution to an engineering problem. Now, you probably can solve some problems in your office, right? But many of them will actually come from the engineers, right? But those engineers don't necessarily have the skills the technical writer has, which is to how to best communicate that information to the audience that needs it, right? So whether that audience is an end user who's going to open a package at their home, or an end user in a factory where that piece of machinery is used, or whether it's to another technical person, right, and another engineer at another plant who needs to implement a fix in response to something that the engineering company has done to improve or change their product, right? So technical writers solve workplace problems by solving the rhetorical problem of choosing the most effective approach to communication of that information, right, and to motivate that action, right, so that the user can understand what they need to know and do what they need to do. Okay. So we're introducing this idea of rhetoric. I'm hopeful that most of you have heard of rhetoric in some form. Like technical writing, it's something that is often defined and described in different ways. And so we just look at a few kind of famous examples. So Plato, of course, way back in classical Greek, writes, rhetoric is the art of enchanting the soul, right? The art of winning the soul through discourse, right? Using language to enchant the souls of people. And for that reason, Plato says that the rhetoric is dangerous. And he critiques people who would use rhetoric to move people towards the wrong thing. And so we already in Plato, a long time ago, started getting the connection between rhetorical discourse and ethics, which will be the focus of next week's lesson. Aristotle, who was Plato's very famous student, is a first person to really write a classification of rhetoric. And he defines rhetoric as the faculty of discovering in any particular case all of the available means of persuasion. In other words, if you have a particular issue, all of the available means of persuasion, different ways to persuade different audiences, right? And he kind of breaks that down if you're interested in reading his On Rhetoric. It's really an excellent way to help you think about how people, even in ancient times, were already thinking about the ways in which we can persuade different people to do or think the things we need them to do or think, right? Cicero then in Rome writes, rhetoric is speech designed to persuade, right? So we see this kind of common theme that, at least in classical times, when rhetoric was primarily oral, that is, speech, that what rhetoricians were trying to do is to get the audience to do something in response to their words, right? Quintilian then writes, rhetoric is the art of speaking well, or a good man speaking well. We call it vir bonus in Latin. And so that's, once again, that idea that ethics matters, that it should be not just speaking well, but also speaking well for good purposes. We'll jump way ahead then to Francis Bacon. We see the influence of the new sciences coming in. The duty and office of rhetoric is to apply reason to imagination for the better moving of the will. Here we see competing ideas of reason and imagination. Reason being kind of that factual approach, and imagination being kind of the ability of you to think and understand, and finding ways then to move the minds. So instead of moving the souls, moving the minds of the audience and the will, right? So George Campbell, an 18th century rhetor from Scotland, writes, rhetoric is that art or talent by which discourse is adapted to its end. So in this case, we see a shift, right? Rather than just that the speaker has a purpose, but that the text itself has an end or a purpose. And in the rhetoric is that ability to shift that message around in ways, right, to change that discourse, to adapt that discourse, so it can achieve its purpose with the audience. And he includes 4 ends of discourse: to enlighten the understanding, to please the imagination, to move the passion, and influence the will. Those are tied to faculty psychology. So if you're interested in 18th century rhetoric, we offer courses in that sometimes. I.A. Richards is a 20th century rhetorician who says that rhetoric is the study of misunderstandings and their remedies. And so here we see a kind of counter definition. So rather than rhetoric being the study of understanding and how to achieve that, which is kind of what the previous definitions say, I.A. Richards is interested in the ways in which sometimes rhetoric fails us, sometimes our messages are not successful, and in understanding why they aren't successful, we can then become better at communicating our messages. Kenneth Burke says the most characteristic concern of rhetoric is the manipulation of men's beliefs for political ends. The basic function of rhetoric is the use of words by human agents to form attitudes or induce actions in other human agents. And so the first half of that, we see that concern about manipulation, right? That the way we use language can manipulate our audiences to think or do things that aren't always, not necessarily the right things, right? And so that's the idea of ethics involved in there once again. But the second part shows us, right, the kind of 2 functions, right? That as writers, we can use our rhetorical discourse, our documents, to get our audience to form particular attitudes, right? To think particular things, or to do particular things, right? To induce actions. Lloyd Bitzer, whose article I've included in this unit, kind of set the stage with a 1968 article where he breaks down the classical rhetorical tradition, basically from Aristotle, and says why this kind of still matters in contemporary writing and rhetorical study. And he says rhetoric is a mode of altering reality, right? So think about, like, the message is the thing you want to say, right? And you're sending that message from the speaker or one writer to the audience. Rhetoric then is is the language that we use to communicate that message, and we present it in a way that alters the reality, right? Not by the direct application of energy or objects, right? Not because we're actually changing reality, right? But by the creation of discourse, which changes reality through the mediation of thought and action, right? We use our words to make people think and do things by convincing them or showing them the way in which we see the problem and the solution. Um, so ultimately, right, in order to get people to solve a problem, you have to first get them to understand that there is a problem. And one way we do that is to make that explicit to them. We're showing them a problem they haven't seen before. We're altering their reality. And once we can convince them to do that, then we have a lot of control over them, he says, right? And so, once again, that ethical issue comes up. So, classically speaking, Aristotle's rhetorical triangle had, right, you can think of it as a triangle. It has three sides and three corners. In each corner, you might write logos, pathos, and ethos. Logos literally means the word. If you've seen the ancient Greek Bibles, right, you will see that logos is that word used also for the word. It's a very important word that's used in lots of different contexts in ancient Greece, obviously, because that's kind of when they first started thinking about language as its own entity. But logos also means kind of, what is that message? What is that thing that we're hoping to communicate to our audience? And how can we think about the way we use reasoning and logic and the way we present that, organize it, arrange it, to appeal to the audience in a way that will help them understand it and want to do something about it? Similarly, pathos. Aristotle was a big fan of logos. He said, he wished we all lived in a more rational world. But he also says that realistically, in order to get people to do things, you have to get them to care about them. And so pathos, you see that word pathetic comes from that root. And somebody's pathetic, kind of, you see them and they're so sad looking, it makes you feel for them. That's an appeal to emotion, right? It's a way to move your audience. And then, of course, the idea of ethos or character. And that's your appeal to character as a writer or as a speaker. But it is also, in contemporary situations, being aware of ethics and the ways in which your document represents not only you as a writer, but also any organization that it represents, right? There's a fourth concern that Bitzer really breaks down that Aristotle addresses, but does not make part of the rhetorical situation explicitly, and that's kairos, and that's an appeal to the moment. Kairos is a concept of time that's different from chronos. So chronos is chronological time, the way we think about time, right? And kairos is instead that moment. We call it the right moment or the occasion of something happening. In contemporary rhetoric, we call that exigency, and we're going to talk about that next. So here are kind of the ways in which we see classical rhetoric transition into the field of tech writing. So we're talking about exigency and purpose, audiences and users, authors, speakers, technical writers, context, cultures, constraints, and documents. And you'll see some connections between then classical rhetoric and contemporary technical writing. So exigency and purpose. Exigency in rhetoric is the issue, the problem, or the situation that causes or prompts someone to write or speak. In other words, there's a reason you're creating this document, right? And that reason, the exigence, is what gives you that right moment, like why this time matters, okay? Exigence comes from the Latin term for the word demand, right? There's a need for this thing. And once again, that you can read more about that in Lloyd Bitzer's article. Purpose refers to why you're writing, what you hope the user will know or do, think, decide, how to behave as a result of reading the document. There are 5 general purposes for communication in the workplace, right? To inform, to describe, to explain, to propose, and to convince. Within those general purposes, of course, you'll find myriad specific purposes. You'll also find that some documents overlap, right? They do more than one thing. They have more than one purpose, and that's completely normal, particularly as you write longer documents. The center of technical writing nowadays is the audience. The audience, we oftentimes call the audience of a technical document the user or the end user. And that's the person or people we expect will actually use the document to solve the problem that we've identified. So audiences need to be able to receive, understand, and use the document to help solve problems. So we have to understand who our audience is. We do that through audience analysis, and we can think about both informal and formal ideas of analysis. We can talk about imagined audiences, which you might call invoked audiences if you want to look in the literature, or addressed audiences, and those are kind of real audiences. And what this leads to in technical writing is an awareness that documents do better if they are actually tested for usability, and sometimes we'll actually do end user tests to make sure the document is meeting the needs of our audience. So these are some kind of things we need to think about as we're thinking about the documents we're writing. As an author, speaker, or technical writer, you have to be aware the workplace writer produces the documents that help solve workplace problems. In that way, the document is a representation of that writer to the users of the document. Even when the writer is uncredited and largely invisible in the document, as they often are in technical writing, a lot of times you won't get to put your name on the documents you write. The user judges the quality of the writer and their work by the quality and usefulness of the document, right? So your document is a representation of you, right? And you want to think about that, right? What are some ways you can make that document stronger to give people a better opinion of you, right? Because you're part of that workplace as well. By extension, then, the user judges the quality of the organization based on the quality of the documents its writers produce and distribute. So you also have to be aware of how your writing impacts and represents the organization itself. Therefore, workplace writers must be mindful of the organizational ethos when producing documents. Context, cultures, and constraints are something that are largely outside of traditional approaches to rhetoric, because the rhetorical situation was thinking about just speakers, and the context for speakers is very clear because the audience faces the speaker, right? When you're speaking to someone, you're right in front of each other. It's not a complex situation. But documents are different, right? Documents we create, and those documents go away from us and are experienced by audiences oftentimes over time and distance, right? So, but it's important to remember that writers, audiences, and documents do not exist in a vacuum, free from various contexts in which problems circulate. Thus, it is important for workplace writers to fully understand the problems in relation to all the factors that influence those problems and their solutions. Have you ever opened instructions and found them to only be in a language you do not understand? That's a fundamental problem that shows that while that set of instructions might have worked perfectly for an audience in their local area, it does not work now that we are living in a global world, right? So part of every context is culture, the customs, the institutions, and beliefs, including the language of a particular people or social group. That culture may be societal, but also includes issues of organizational culture, national culture, and international culture. Cultural awareness is increasingly important in the field of technical communication as technology and development make cross-cultural interchange easier and more essential to workplaces. In other words, there are a lot more international companies nowadays, and even companies that aren't international tend to have the opportunity to engage internationally via things like social media. Some aspects of context lead to what we call constraints, and constraints are things that limit what a technical writer can do. Obvious constraints include time and money, right? Some people say, if you had all the money in the world, you could solve any problem, right? But nobody has all the money in the world, right? These are realistic constraints. Maybe you need to produce a document that does a certain thing, but you don't have money to print it. So how are you going to distribute it, right? These are constraints to a particular writing project. But constraints don't have to be physical, right? Instead, you think that meeting any kind of expectations or limitations, right, even of a significantly different culture, may place constraints on what a technical writer can do in creating a document. You can think about something as simple as hand gestures, like the thumbs up for us generally means it's a good thing and we got it, and the thumbs up can be like our middle finger in some other cultures, right? So there are constraints in this case in the way we use visuals in a document that we need to be aware of as we're working. Ultimately, we also need to think about the document itself. And documents we can think about in different ways, right? Different documents have different genres. The document itself is a medium, right? So there's different media through which that document can be produced and distributed. And oftentimes that's tied to technology, right? So a document is the medium through which a message is relayed to an audience. Choosing the right medium is part of the rhetorical problem that faces every technical writer. Awareness of technological solutions for communication, from printing to folding techniques to audio to video to interactive computer technologies and so on, will allow the writer more options when deciding on the appropriate medium. Related to medium is the presence of often well-defined genres in technical writing. Many of those genres persist and carry with them expectations that guide the work of technical writers. Others are evolving with the evolution of new technologies, right? So remember that genres in a workplace are sometimes really convenient because people know exactly what the document's going to look like and where to find the information they need. We can't just blow up all the genres because we decide that we don't like them, right? Instead, as a technical writer, we need to be able to examine those genres and use them effectively. And if they don't work, right, then to kind of start that transformation within your organization to allow you to improve or replace that genre with a document that will actually meet the needs of the user better moving forward. So ultimately, we would think about kind of, well, what does that mean for when we're creating a document? And we think about this, you might have certainly heard of the idea of the writing process or writing processes. In this case, we're going to think about technical writing process as what is commonly called the problem-solving approach. This is a general pattern that we see in lots of technical writing textbooks, but this particular one is tied to Sidney Dobrin, Christopher Keller, and Christian Weisser's technical communication in the 21st century, which unfortunately is now out of print because it's the book I enjoyed using in the past. But we'll see how they're kind of tied to what Cicero called the 5 canons or the 5 tenets of rhetoric, and contemporary kind of technical writing processes. So Cicero says, right, everything begins with invention or inventio. You could think of this as pre-writing, if you think about a kind of traditional writing process, pedagogy. Disputio or arrangement, right? That's kind of, if you think of that's kind of your organizational stage, you might build an outline kind of idea. And so what Cicero says is first you need to kind of understand the topic and how it might best be addressed, and then arrangement is how we're going to put that together to make sure that we've addressed the issue in all the best possible ways. Elocutio or style has to do with your actual language choices. And memoria, memory, because of course if we're talking about oral rhetoric, we're talking about memorizing the thing that you're going to present so that you can then deliver it, right? Pronunciato, which is delivery. And it's very similar then, if we look now, right? We might start by thinking about what do we have to do to plan this document? What more information do we need for research? Put it together in some kind of draft, take time then to review it, and ultimately distribute it. And so the technical writer, while not every workplace will involve you doing all of these steps, for example, distribution may not be up to you, this is a good way to think about that process as a whole, from beginning of a writing project to its distribution to some kind of user. So plan, understand the rhetorical situation. Define or describe the real problem or reason for writing, right? That's the exigency. Establish goals and purposes for writing. That's your purpose, right? Identify stakeholders and what they want or need. That's your audience. Consider the ethical choices involved with the problem. That has to do with you as the writer. Consider the document formats and delivery methods. Think about that as the document, right? Identify what information you have and what information you need. That's content or message. Logos, right? Choose technology that will best assist you and your audience. Think about the document, right? You're thinking about the technology you're going to use. And locate the setting for the document's distribution and use. What is the context of that document? When you're researching, determine the types of information necessary and how to get them, right? What is the problem? What is the solution? What are the expectations of the rhetorical situation? What is the context of the communication? These are all important things. If it's the first time you're writing a document for a new audience, and that audience happens to be across the world, you might need to do some research on what their expectations are going to be in that document and how people in that culture tend to use documents in the workplace. That's just as important as actually understanding the problem and the solution. Because you can have a great solution, but if nobody can understand how to implement it because your documentation is not effective, then you failed as a technical writer. Then, of course, you conduct your research and gather information, organize the information you've gathered, and make sure you evaluate the information and decide if further research is necessary, right? Sometimes as you research things, you realize, well, I need to know more things, and that's okay. It's not linear, right? This is something we can do recursively. Oftentimes, as we're researching, we find more things that lead us back to planning, for example. Similarly, drafting is we use the word draft instead of write because draft has this concept or idea of redoing and redoing and redoing and making corrections throughout, right? So confirm your goals and purposes, your document format, and delivery methods. Organize and draft the document, design and arrange the document, create and integrate other media that help communicate the information if appropriate, like visuals or audios or videos or whatever, right? This is the idea of kind of actually now putting together a draft of what the document might look like, and including, right, the idea is not only of like making sure we achieve our purpose and we set up our format and what technology we're going to use, but also how that information should be organized, how it should look on the page. We call that design. A lot of times you'll be working in a team in that case with somebody who is a graphic designer. And then also with the ability to integrate different media in a single document, if it's computer-based, is something that has really changed the ways in which we write things. If you've looked at instructions recently for things like toys, I have 2 children, so at Christmas, of course, they open their toys. A lot of them now have links to YouTube videos that allow them to watch how to use something in addition to the written instructions. A lot of instructions are just visual now, right? Very little writing other than warnings and things like that, right? So these are things that we need to think about as we're putting together our document. Ultimately, we want to review our document, of course, at least ourselves, right? We need to be aware of a few things, test the accessibility of the documents, and then we'll talk about later in the semester is the issue of accessibility, not just for general audiences, but also for specific audiences who might have accessibility issues with typically produced documents. So thinking about producing documents for people with different disabilities. If you feel a little pushback towards that, think about the fact that everybody gets older in our society, and we now have the baby boomer generation, our largest generation, moving into that age when even people who did not have disabilities, have not had disabilities in the past, are now having to wear thicker and thicker glasses, perhaps even to the point where their glasses don't solve all their vision problems, where they are increasingly using hearing aids, where they want to read things in larger print. These are all kinds of accommodations that have to do with accessibility, right? That is creating documents that the actual user, the people they're intended for, can access that information, right? That's before we even talk about the next thing, which is testing the usability of the document. Can they actually use the document to complete the task they want to do? I don't know about you, but I'm not a great cook, And so when I follow a recipe, if there's any kind of confusing step in there, or one of those recipes where they accidentally skip a step, uh, my end result is not great, right? And that's a usability issue, right? So I'm able to access and read the information there, but the information there does not lead me to complete the process in a successful way. Um, we can do this by soliciting feedback and response from peers, colleagues, superiors, and users, right? Um, and of course, we want to be able to revise and rewrite the document based on feedback. And finally, make sure that every document we produce is as correct and complete as possible. The final step of any technical document, I don't like to think of it as a final step, but it's kind of the end of that process, is the distribution of the document itself. So we have to always make sure we are, if we're responsible for distributing the document, make sure that we are using appropriate means to transmit the document. So how can I make sure the document that I've created gets to the people who need it? Is the best way via email, or is the best way via snail mail? Should I post on a website, notify people, right? There are lots of different ways to distribute documents. Some of them are not distributed at all, right? Some documents are just there as reference, and people don't even know they exist until they need them. And oftentimes then it's too late, right? So part of what we do when we distribute is make sure people, the appropriate people are aware that the document has been distributed and is available. Transmit the document to the intended audience, including related documents or attachments when applicable, with necessary information to invite and allow the user to use the document, right? So oftentimes when we send a document, we'll also send with some kind of cover letter, or maybe it's an email that says, please find attached this document that does these things, right? And what that does is it gives them context for what that document is and why they might need it or how they should use it. Follow up to ensure your audience receive the document and can access and use the document. If you've worked online at all, you'll know that sometimes when you send messages to people, they get lost in their junk mail, they get filtered out, or they get the information but they can't open the attached file, for example. These are things that, as technical writers working with real audiences, we need to be aware are potential issues. And then finally, once it's kind of out there and actually in use, we need to be able to assess the document's outcomes and decide if further correspondence is needed. Sometimes there are errors, right? So you print a document and it's missing a page. Well, you might need to send a follow-up that includes that page, right? Or if it's the great thing about a digital document, it's easy to go back and add in that page. A printed document is more complicated, right? But oftentimes there'll be corrections to things, especially when they're created in time-sensitive environments, when we would like to have a perfect document, but we just simply run out of time. If you've ever been to an academic conference, you've likely seen a printed sheet next to the book of different presentations available that says these particular presentations have been canceled or moved or added to the agenda. And that's because it's time sensitive and somebody missed a deadline somewhere or something happened after that deadline when they had to go to the printer and we have a follow-up, right? Sometimes documents are complete and epic fails, and that's kind of the point of taking a class like this, is to help you catch those before you get there. But sometimes you have to begin that revision of that document for the next generation of the product or the technology immediately, so that you don't repeat that same mistake the second time around. So remember, that's all a process, right? The problem-solving approach, which we're going to use this semester, like any writing process, is not always linear. That is, entry points into the process will vary according to task, and there's no set beginning or end to the process. Writers may conduct only a few of the tasks, they may repeat tasks, they may approach the tasks in varying orders. In fact, writers may often find it necessary to go back to earlier stages if they have difficulties at any step along the way. Thinking about the process in this way doesn't mean you have to follow it, right? Step one, step two. It just means that these are things we should be aware of, and an easier way to think about that is to classify them around some basic ideas. So don't think of it as like, this is step one, I have to do this, step two, I have to do this. If it was that easy, we would all have a recipe for writing perfect documents on stuck to our computer screens, right? Instead, right, these are a lot of different things we can consider. And as we talk about specific documents, there are certainly some more step-by-step guides we can follow, but we're always going to have these bigger rhetorical concerns in our head in the background. If you have any questions, let me know. I'm here to help. Thanks for sticking around.